Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Macaulay. Greetings to you. I am a minister of the gospel, but today I'm doing something a little different. Last month was Black History Month in the USA, and my church, Crossroads Covenant Church in DeSoto, as part of our Black History Month celebration, decided to have a special presentation called Honoring Our Ancestors. Myself and my sister Diana were chosen as one of the families who were invited to share our family history. We chose to focus on our parents, who obviously were the most dominant influences in our lives. And we chose to chronicle their experiences as being part of the Windrush Generation. We did this as a sort of newsreel in print, but since it was done in print, I'm going to share some of the highlights of that in this brief video presentation. So basically, these are my recollections of a childhood growing up in the UK as a first-generation Black British person whose parents arrived in the Windrush Generation. So, who were the Windrush Generation? My parents, Oswald and Kathleen Macaulay, migrated from Jamaica to the UK in 1950 and 1952 respectively. They met and married in London. They came by ship and were among thousands of Jamaicans and other Caribbean people who migrated to the UK and became known as the Windrush Generation. The first arrival of the Empire Windrush was in June 1948, when it landed at Tilbury Docks, about 20 miles from London. These voyagers, most of them from Jamaica, were the first large group of Caribbean and predominantly Black migrants to arrive in the UK. It is estimated that between 1948 and around 1970, over 256,000 people migrated to the UK from the Caribbean. They arrived in the UK on British passports because at that time Jamaica was still a British colony. They did not arrive by accident, but after the devastation of World War II, many areas of London were all but demolished, as was the country's economy. So the people who became known as the Windrush Generation were invited to Britain to lay roads, drive buses, clean hospitals, and nurse the sick, helping to rebuild the country after the devastation of World War II. Some of those who came were returning servicemen from the Second World War, recruited from Britain's colonies in the Caribbean. From 1944, West Indian women served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and the Auxiliary Territorial Service in Britain. From 1944 to 1945, nearly 5,500 West Indian Royal Air Force servicemen came to Britain. The SS Windrush was in fact originally a military ship. My mother was around 20 when she travelled to the UK. She had studied to become a beautician in Jamaica, but like many, she wanted to go overseas for better opportunities. But due to her being a single woman of tender age, she travelled with her guardian, who was her uncle, my great-uncle, who had served in the Royal Air Force and who had already been to the UK and wanted to return for a better life for himself. My dad went to trade school in Jamaica and was a certified mechanic. He worked for a few years at Kingston Pumping Station, but like many, the prospects abroad and the opportunity to perhaps earn enough money to come back to Jamaica and open his own workshop seemed very appealing at that time. On arrival, they connected with other Jamaicans who helped them to find accommodation. Life was not easy for them as new immigrants in the UK. The majority of them probably intended only to stay in the UK for a few years and return. But as in the case of my parents, after getting married and having children, many of them chose to stay. The arrival of West Indians in the UK changed the face of the UK forever because they brought their food, music and culture to the UK, and their contributions to the UK society have been far-reaching, making especially London probably the most racially and culturally diverse nation in the world. So life was difficult for the newly arrived West Indian immigrants, and one of the main areas of difficulty was in the area of housing discrimination. As newly arrived black immigrants in the UK, in the 1950s, the British people were not as tolerant as they are today, and they are a lot more tolerant today. Signs saying no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs were commonplace, and they were posted outside rent homes, which made it very difficult for black people to find accommodation. And when they did, it was substandard and expensive. In order to escape this housing discrimination, those blacks who did have homes would rent rooms to other black people. And since banks discriminated against black people by making it harder for them to qualify for loans, black people had to be resourceful and draw on their experiences in the Caribbean and tailor them to their situation in the UK. Through these things, our parents taught us how to be resilient, to adapt to new environments and challenging circumstances, and they had to be creative. Many of the black people who bought homes did so through money invested in partner or susu investment clubs in order to get their down payments. This is something that they brought with them from Jamaica, and it's practiced in similar ways throughout the Caribbean. Every week, a group of 10, 20 or more people would agree to put an agreed upon sum of money into a collective pool or cash pot, and each week, one person would get the total sum collected. This cycle would be repeated until all participants got their draw, and then the cycle would repeat itself again. The banker would usually be a trusted person of good standing in the black community. The whole system relied on trust, and it brought people into community with each other. So paying your partner money, it ranked high on the scale of priorities in the household budget after rent, mortgage, utilities and food were paid. Some people were in 2 or 3 partners at a time, or sometimes they would two people would throw half a hand to get a full hand, and they would split the draw whenever it came. So sometimes people were working an extra job or doing overtime just to pay their partner money, and they timed it so that their draw would come in time to do a home improvement or to pay for a trip back to the West Indies. Many of the white British people were astonished at how quickly newly arrived black immigrants were able to purchase homes, when they who had lived there, whose generations went back for decades, were unable to do so. And a lot of them said that black people were making money from drugs and prostitution, and it caused a lot of resentment and jealousy. But the secret to our success was not drugs or prostitution, but hard work and partner. And among Caribbeans, the system thrived, and it continues to do so until this very day. Once home ownership was achieved, people would rent rooms and open their doors to newly arrived immigrants from the Caribbean. My parents participated in these schemes, and once they acquired their home, they opened their doors and helped many newcomers to do the same. We do miss and reminisce on those early days in the UK. They were hard times, but they were good times. Our home was always full. There was always a revolving door because my parents were pretty well known in the black community in our town. Every Saturday, my mom, they used to call her Mrs. Mac, would have a big pot of Jamaican beef soup on the stove, and many people would stop by for a bowl of soup, a tot of rum, and a chat. I've got very fond memories of those early days in the UK. So, of course, during these times, growing up as a black British person born in the UK, there was a lot of discrimination. And this took place primarily in social and economic employment discrimination. Initially, in the very beginning of this migration, there was not a lot of discrimination in employment because after the war, the UK, and especially London, had suffered severe damage from the bombing. So there was a great need for labourers, and people skilled in carpentry and construction were in high demand. So people like my dad easily found jobs that paid pretty well. The UK's national free healthcare system had also just started. So many black women were able to train and find work as nurses or aides. And there were lots of jobs in public transportation and factories. But discrimination was more rampant in the area of entertainment and in social relationships with white British people. As I said before, when they really needed our help, black people were initially warmly welcomed into the UK. But once it looked as if their stay was going to be more permanent, things began to change. London has always been known for its vibrant nightlife, but blacks were not admitted to the local pubs or to the nightclubs in the West End. And since many of these newly arrived black immigrants were young, on the weekends they needed a social outlet. This outlet came in the form of the blues dance or shebeen. What is a blues dance? A blues dance is basically a house party where an admission fee is charged and liquor and food is sold. Entertainment was provided by various sound systems, you'd call them mobile DJs today, which also came from Jamaica at that time. So on any given Saturday night, there would be several blues dances taking place in any location which had a Caribbean community of any size. However, because the sale of food and alcohol was illegal, and because the sound systems pumping Jamaican music could sometimes be heard blocks away, these events caused a lot of resentment among the local British people, who would invariably call the police. However, in some parts of London, there were just too many of them for the police to keep up with. Sometimes the police would come and tell them to turn it down, and the host would soften them up with Jamaican food and 100 proof rum, that white rum. The cops would get happy and leave them to enjoy the rest of the night and tell them to just turn it down. But sometimes the evenings would end with arrests and violence. These house parties, which for a long time that was pretty much all we saw on a Saturday night, these house parties really changed the face of UK entertainment for many years to come. Some of the more daring local white youths would come to these dances and enjoy themselves and soak up the music and culture until the wee hours of the morning. Many of the entertainers from the UK, from the late 70s and 80s, such as Boy George, Bowie, UB40, many others. Many of them got their musical influences from those blues dances and sound systems, where not only Jamaican music, but also American R&B was played. Towards the late 70s and early 80s, with the first generation Black British people such as myself coming of age, Black people began to purchase and run their own nightclubs, or they would lease entertainment venues. And some of the nightclubs which had previously refused admission to Black people began to open their doors and let us in. So the blues dances began to fade away. They were, however, as I said before, for quite a few years, a great source of entertainment and also a good source of income for those who held them while they lasted. Because for many of the newly arrived Black people in the UK, it was all that we had. And these blues dances, don't get me wrong, they were not shabby affairs. Both men and women dressed up in their finest, got their hair done, and it was a night out. They really looked forward to that Saturday night blues, and sometimes there was more than one to go to. And without the internet or radio advertising, people would get little invitation cards printed out and pass them on to their friends, or leave them at various stalls in the market, or leave them at the record shops where Jamaican music was sold. It would not have been unusual to have a blues with 50 people to 150 people or even more in attendance. Each sound system, we had a relative who had a very popular sound system in London called Metro Downbeat, and he was very popular. And he carried his own crowd. So anywhere Metro was playing, whether it be the Friday night, the Saturday night, or sometimes a Sunday night at a pub, his posse would go with him. These blues dances, they may have been illegal, but people needed community, and they supplied that need. And for a lot of people, for a lot of Black people, it was the only place where they could really freely enjoy themselves on a weekend. Let's talk a little bit about the food. I went back to UK in 2020 and I was surprised at how many Jamaican and Caribbean restaurants and grocery stores there were. When we lived in the UK, you had to travel to find Jamaican food. And the only Jamaican restaurant I ever went to was run by my mother's friend, Mrs. Campbell, who eventually moved to the USA herself. She had a small restaurant behind Ridley Road Market, which was one of the main places to purchase Caribbean food, Ridley Road Market. So Ridley Road Market, that was a vibrant market which sold Caribbean food in North London. It was also a meeting place, a place where people could meet friends and get the latest news from the Caribbean. And in our household, going to Ridley Road, because we at that time had moved to East London, to Leytonstone, it was like a weekly pilgrimage. All roads led to Ridley Road, in particular, the number 236 bus. But in addition to Ridley Road Market, which primarily served North and East London, there was also Brixton Market and Shepherd's Bush Market, which served South and West London. These were the main places where you could obtain fresh fish, such as the type that people from the Caribbean were used to, and Caribbean food. But also, pre-DoorDash and pre-Amazon days, there were a few enterprising individuals who sold Caribbean food on a mobile basis. And they had trucks or vans, which they kitted out, and they were set up like mini grocery stores. And they had all the Caribbean essentials on hand. And these would do a circuit primarily through word of mouth, and they would follow a route and bring Caribbean food to specific households. There were also a few Caribbean bakeries who would sell hardo bread and patties. And I remember that during the 70s, when there was a national bread strike and all the major producers and bakeries stopped producing bread, many white English people came into the Caribbean bakeries because they had not stopped production, and many of them, for the first time, bought West Indian hardo bread and other Caribbean delights that were on offer, and many of them came back. As I've already said, the UK was radically changed by the arrival of black immigrants from the Caribbean. Eventually, this wave of immigration was replaced by the arrival of thousands of East Indian immigrants to the UK. I remembered most English people referred to Jamaican or ethnic food as foreign muck. They say, I'm not having that foreign muck, and they wouldn't touch it. But a recent survey revealed that instead of fish and chips being the UK's most popular Friday night takeout meal, it has now been replaced by chicken tikka masala, which is delicious and which is a dish of Indian origin. So things have really changed in the UK. Our parents taught us that every black person that we saw was family. In those days, due to discrimination, we had to be our brother's keeper, regardless of what island either we or our parents were from. In the eyes of the English, we were all one and the same. One day, myself and another Jamaican guy about my age, who lived further down the street, we got into a nasty fight. And it was round about that time that my dad was coming home from work. My dad pulled us aside and told us to shake hands and to remember that as immigrants in a strange land, we had to look out for each other. From that day on, myself and Paul Powell was his name. We became very good friends. Paul has since gone back to Jamaica. One of the families who rented from my dad were an Indian family who had just arrived from Durban, South Africa. I really don't know where my dad met them from or how they got to know us. But it is possible that it might have been through our GP, our local doctor, Dr. Raja, who was Indian herself. George and Mamie became like family to us. And I guess it's from that experience that I gained a passion for Indian food. When my parents moved to a larger home, George, Mamie, and their two sons moved with us. And they stayed with us until they could purchase their own home. As I reflect upon the impact my parents had on us during this Black History Month, I'd say they taught us to be resilient and adaptable in the face of difficulty and challenging situations. They taught us to be open and accepting of others and to look upon each other as family, because in their case, especially at that time, family was thousands of miles away. And they taught us to celebrate our Jamaican culture and to share it freely with others when given the opportunity. My parents were not highly educated or hugely successful, but it really warmed my heart when I began to connect with long-lost friends through Facebook that our parents had touched their lives or their parents' lives in a special way, and that the Macaulay name had brought back good memories to them. And these qualities have served us well. In the 40 years that we've lived in the USA, being resilient, being adaptable, things have definitely not always been easy for us here. We've had to go through many changes. We've had to pack our bags and start all over again on more than one occasion. But through it all, God has been good to us. We were taught community spirit, the ability to include and incorporate others into our circle. people who may not always be our equals or share our values. But like our parents, moving here to Dallas, we had to be like pioneers and make family where we found them. Because all of us respond well to love, acceptance, and inclusion. And to this day, we still practice that love and hospitality that our parents taught us. And it brings us great joy to be able to do so. So you have a blessed rest of the day. And I do hope you enjoyed this page from my past, if you will. God bless you all.